Hi, this is George Mueller, and this is an introduction to World War II for students in my History 136 class. As you may remember from last time, America was sitting back from the war and attempting not to get involved while the Nazis went into a series of conflicts with their neighbors and then England and France. Now, early on, it became obvious that while the U.S. didn't want to be involved in the war, and in particular the U.S. public did not want to be involved in the war, we definitely chose sides. And the vast majority of people in the U.S. didn't want to side with the Nazis. They wanted to side with England. And this is especially true from about 1938 on. American public opinion had really caught on to what the Nazis represented. Now, FDR was looking for ways to support England in particular, but other allies as well, and he pushed for measures, all measures short of war. So there were things like trading destroyers for bases, that's World War I ships for bases on English territory around the world. But there were real limits. Especially going into the 1940 election, there were real limits on what Roosevelt could do without looking like he was getting the U.S. involved in an unnecessary war and possibly losing the election. After his re-election, they stepped up what they were doing to help, in particular, England. First, they went to the Lend-Lease program where if England couldn't pay for military goods that they were getting from the U.S., we would lend them to her, with them to be returned later if they didn't get blown up, or lease them with them making lease payments in the future. And there was essentially an undeclared naval war between German U-boats, which were sinking ships going to England, and American ships in the Atlantic as early as 41 and even 1940. By 41, in the autumn, FDR is convinced the U.S. is going to wind up at war with Germany. But he's not actually right. Because the U.S. will enter the war because of Japan, not Germany. Japan had allied with the Germans and Italians earlier, although this was a secret treaty at first. And when Germany went to war with England and France, Japan went along with her allies and attacked English and French colonial possessions in Asia. It was very convenient in that way because it pulled English troops, especially English colonial troops that's from English possessions outside of England, things like Indians and Australians and South Africans, were pulled away from moving to support England herself to having to defend their own nations, because there was a real threat that Japan would invade places like Australia, which would be unprecedented, but even South Africa was open to invasion by the Japanese. The U.S. reacted, again, by trying to avoid outright war, but what they did was to enact economic sanctions against Japan, particularly cutting off her supplies of rubber and oil. And since Japan didn't have her own supplies of either one of those two necessary military commodities, they were in trouble. And so the Japanese decided to take a gamble, and they had a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, which destroyed a lot of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. This was designed to cripple the U.S. and avoid a long war. It's what the Japanese had done before World War I when they went to war with Russia, old Imperial Russia. They had done a very similar sneak attack, sank the Russian Navy. Bada bing, bada boom, they won the war easily. Now, some people have called this an act of desperation. The Japanese didn't look at much else to call it enough other options to call it an act of desperation. They never considered giving up their idea of having an empire and taking lands from other nations in to rule in Asia. So calling it an act of desperation, if it's the first thing you try, it's not exactly desperation. And you have to also understand, at this point, the Axis powers are winning. Remember, when the U.S. comes into the war, well, just before the U.S. comes into the war, Germany's in a situation where everything on this map that's in green or this kind of blue-green, they've either occupied or it's an allied nation. That's a lot. You have Iceland, where there's almost nobody. You have the United Kingdom, and some of her possessions in North Africa, particularly Egypt, are all that remained unoccupied by the Nazis and their allies. And remember, early on, the Soviet Union is actually allied with Germany. So it's England against not quite the world, but an awful lot of the world. But this isn't going to remain. For the Germans, England was a tough nut to crack. It's an island protected by one of the strongest navies in the world, and quite frankly, Hitler wanted to take care of Russia and then turn his sights back to England. So there was a bombing campaign against England, which of course failed to bring England to her knees. But in the meantime, German troops invade Russia in what's known as Operation Barbarossa. And at first it goes very well for the Germans. The Russian army collapses. But as the Germans move further and further into Russia, the Russians do not surrender. And instead, the Germans have longer and longer lines of supply where they're constantly being attacked from people in the countryside, and it becomes something of a quagmire for them. And when the U.S. enters the war, you have to work out how you're going to beat Germany and Italy. So far, they have been, and even Japan has been practically undefeated. Not only have they been winning the war, they've won practically every battle. The first thing the U.S. set out to do, and this is even before we were formally involved in the war, was what are we trying to do? They set out the Atlantic Charter, which is mostly a restatement of the 13 points from World War I, but it's America's war aims. And it's important to note, Russia will not sign this document. England, the U.S., I believe France signs it, but not the USSR. Another meeting was the Casablanca Conference, where Churchill, de Gaulle, who's the leader of the Free French in exile, and Roosevelt got together and agreed that they would demand unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. But the first really big meeting, and this is the important one, the Tehran Conference, is where the big three, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, meet and set out their plans for the end of the war. And their plan is to have the U.S. invade someplace as soon as possible. This is a bit more of a challenge than you might expect. Russia wanted the U.S. to invade France. The problem is, invading France would take new equipment, specialized vehicles that could move from a ship to shore, and would take experienced troops, or you run the danger of losing the battle and having your whole army simply destroyed attempting this amphibious invasion. So the U.S. opts for a safer strategy of invading North Africa, which is much less heavily defended. There are Axis troops in the area, but not nearly as many of them. And the U.S. can use the time to learn how to fight a modern war, to build new weapons and new equipment and learn how to use that equipment without being exposed to being destroyed directly on the European continent. And the Germans will have to send troops to fight them. But this is seen as being a safer way, although slower. And the major campaigns include the Battle of the Atlantic. This is between German submarines, which are sinking ships carrying supplies, including food, to England. When the U.S. enters the war, there are many people who claim that England was only a few weeks away from starvation. Maybe not. That seems to be a little exaggerated to me. But definitely England was in a bad way for a lot of industrial goods. And Canada had a massive industrial capacity to build things like trucks, but also tanks and guns and things. So securing the supply line was very important. Operation Torch is that invasion of North Africa. After that's carried out, Sicily will be invaded in 43, and Operation Overlord, the attack on France, is in 44. In the Pacific, the U.S. Pursues a strategy of attacking individual islands. It's called island hopping. So instead of trying to take all this myriad of islands, and there really are thousands of them in the area, instead of trying to take each one, they took important ones, established airfields, and resupply for ships, and moved ever closer to Japan. And as soon as they were close enough, began carrying out firebombing raids on the Japanese. 42 in the Battle of Coral Sea really saw the first Japanese defeat, and it's one they never totally are able to recover from. The final chapter of World War II involves the use of the most powerful weapon ever developed, the atomic bomb. It's ironic that it was used by Harry S. Truman. He was a vice president to a president who had left him out of the loop on many things, including the development of the atomic bomb. So Truman stepped into FDR's shoes in a situation he didn't totally understand, with a new weapon that he didn't really understand was different significantly than other large bombs. The bomb had been designed to be used on Berlin, Germany, but by the time it was ready, it was clear that Germany was faltering and was going to be conquered without the use of the atomic bomb. So a move was made to switch it to the Pacific for use against Japan. At the time, the logic was that the Japanese had been unwilling to surrender in cases even when they were outmanned and clearly beaten. So a large weapon that would be really devastating could force, the theory was, that could force them to surrender, where a more traditional island invasion might lead to really massive losses. And in fact, projections said that the U.S. was going to lose at least 1 million men, maybe as many as 2 million men invading the islands, and that the civilian casualties that would occur in fighting on the islands, home islands of Japan, would be massive, maybe totaling as much as half the total population, with a further quarter of the population perhaps starving to death immediately after the war during chaos. So the U.S. was really interested in a weapon that could avoid that kind of massive loss of life on both sides. Now, it's ironic to say that you're using an atomic bomb to save lives, and some people actually do laugh at that idea. But that was something that's talked about in the memoirs of a number of people who worked on the atomic bomb, and Harry S. Truman in particular. Now, there are a number of controversies about the use of the atomic bomb. I can't go into all of them, but there were 2 bombs used, one on Hiroshima, then 3 days later on Nagasaki. Those 2 were civilian cities, although with air defenses and military industrial complexes in both of them. So that's the choice to attack those and not do something like bomb an area outside of Tokyo has been criticized by later people, although at the time it appeared to make sense. Well, whatever your opinion about it, the end of World War II is going to become because of the bomb.